What's going down, APUSH? Today we're going to look at the Industrial Revolution, roughly from the Civil War all the way up until 1900. A couple things to know about the Industrial Revolution. By 1900, America would become the leading industrial power in the world. It's going to be a rapid economic transformation of American society, and this is going to impact the country economically, socially, and politically. And really, manufacturing is going to replace agriculture as the primary source of economic growth. And as a result of this rise of big business, you're going to have massive migrations, huge amounts of immigrants coming in, people moving within the United States, as well as urbanization, people moving to the cities. And so, key to this is there's a huge number of inventions and innovations taking place, and this allows for greater productivity. A large number of new inventions are developed during this period, and a huge number of patents are issued. And as a result, some of those kind of key ones, Alexander Graham Bell introduces the telephone, Thomas Edison with all of his inventions at Menlo Park with the electric light, and this allows for new changes to take place, because these inventions and innovations will change daily lives. They'll create new jobs for people and have social consequences. And you could see that in the image right there with women entering the workforce as receptionists, secretaries, and other positions within companies. Now, the first big business in this era is going to be the railroads, and there's a huge increase of railroad production after the Civil War, and it is really the result of land and loan subsidies given by the federal government to the railroad companies. This period was a period of laissez faire when it comes to regulating companies, but the government is very pro-business and very much pro-railroad because they're basically hooking them up with land. And the government's going to do this because they're going to hope that this is going to increase the value of federal land out in the West, and they're hoping to get preferred rates for the carrying of federal mail or to transport troops out in the West. And what you see is the railroad companies getting all this land and these loans are going to establish new business practices, such as establishing the modern stockholder corporation, business management strategies, new ways of financing, and the regulation of competition. And you're going to see the railroad grow tremendously, and with that you're going to have consolidation, meaning fewer and fewer railroad companies are controlling the market, which is also going to lead to standardization of the industry. For instance, the steel rail, the transition to the steel rail, and standardizing gauges, the width between the track. This is key to allow for greater efficiency. As a result of the growth of the railroad, you also have this huge movement of people out into the Trans-Mississippi West. And we're going to cover that in another lecture, but this age of railroads is happening at the same time as the settlement of the Great Plains. And key to this story is the first Transcontinental Railroad. And if you recall, it was established actually during the Civil War by Republicans in Congress with the Pacific Railroad Act. They allowed for the route being established, and the federal government is going to help out in this process. And this gets started after the Civil War is over, and they're going to divide the task between the blue line is going to be the Union Pacific, and they're going to build from Omaha, Nebraska to the west, and largely Irish workers, former Civil War veterans, and the other crew is going to be the Central Pacific Company. And they're going to be building from Sacramento through the very difficult terrain of the Sierra Nevadas, and they're going to have a huge reliance on Chinese laborers to do that very difficult work. And the big moment comes in 1869 at Promontory Point when the two companies meet and the golden spike is laid, marking the completion of the first Transcontinental Railroad. And this is going to have huge consequences. The building of the railroads are going to have huge impacts. It's going to unify the domestic market, create a national market for goods. It allows for the mass distribution of raw materials and manufactured goods from coast to coast. It's going to encourage mass production, mass consumption, and economic specialization. Different parts of the country are going to be specializing on certain products. And finally, It's going to help promote the growth of other industries, for example, coal, steel, etc., and lead to the growth of new cities. If your city's by a rail station, you're going to have a tremendous growth as a result. It's going to facilitate immigration both internally and externally, and it's going to change the lives of Americans. In fact, the American Railroad Association divided the country into 4 time zones in 1883 so that there could be greater efficiency, and later on the government would adopt that as well. Now, we got a problem here because there was a lot of corruption and wrongdoing in the railroad industry. If you remember from previous lectures, the Credit Mobilier scandal, you had government officials being bribed by the railroad companies. And these railroad tycoons are becoming extremely powerful. People like Cornelius Vanderbilt are amassing huge amounts of wealth, and as a result, federal land grants and friendly loans led that corruption to seep into the government. You're going to have frequent speculative bubbles where you have overbuilding taking place, and that overbuilding will lead to economic chaos. Speculators are attempting to sell overvalued stock to the public, and as a result, this overbuilding leads to companies going bankrupt very frequently. Mismanagement and fraud plague the industry. Rebates or discounts were oftentimes given to favored shippers, so there was all sorts of different pricing. And as a result of this, small farmers were often charged higher rates than others, and they're going to be the victims of the powerful railroad companies. And pools were created, and pools were secret agreements between the companies to fix rates and share profits. So there really wasn't fair competition taking place. And as a result of this concern over the railroad's power over the public and the government, there began to be discussions about should the government regulate. There starts to be demands that the government should intervene. Now keep in mind the dominant philosophy of the time is laissez faire, leave alone, no regulation, but farmers become the most vocal group in calling for reform. And really you see that in the Grange movement. We're going to cover that in another video, but the Grange movement is an organization of farmers demanding change. And they get some regulations. In the famous case of Munn versus Illinois in 1877, the court rules the state could regulate business. However, Munn versus Illinois, those Granger laws as they were called, are overturned in the Wabash case when the court ruled that states could not regulate interstate commerce. And interstate commerce is trade between different states. And the public begins to demand that the federal government does something to overhaul the capitalist system during the Gilded Age. And you get the Interstate Commerce Act passed in 1887. And it does a couple of things. It sets up the Interstate Commerce Commission. The federal government would oversee business. They would ban pooling, rebates, and rate fixing. And companies, railroad companies, had to publish rates. Now, the Interstate Commerce Commission is important. It is the first large-scale attempt by the federal government to regulate business in the interest of society at large. So the government is watching and monitoring business. Now, important to keep in mind, the ICC was initially not very effective. And it would not be until the progressive movement later on at the early 20th century where you're going to see more effective regulations being put in place. Now, during this time, you also have the rise of other industries, the heavy industries. Railroad is just one, but you have oil, steel, and coal as well. And kind of the two figures that you should definitely know about is John D. Rockefeller, the head of Standard Oil, and Andrew Carnegie, the guy in the steel industry. And it's important while you're reading to understand whether or not these people should be viewed as captains of industry or robber barons. Key concepts for this time period, business practices done, was something called horizontal integration. Make sure you know about that. And this is controlling all competition in a particular industry, merging competing, for example, oil companies. Rockefeller did this into one giant corporation, and you want to consolidate all competitors so you have no competition or very little competition so that you are able to monopolize the market. And so horizontal integration was done by these business leaders such as Rockefeller. The other one is vertical integration, and this one is controlling all aspects of manufacturing, from extracting the raw materials to selling the finished product. And the idea behind this business practice is you improve efficiency by making supplies much more reliable, you eliminate the middleman, and you're able to control all stages of production. And this was done by Andrew Carnegie in the steel industry. And these vertical integration strategies and horizontal integration strategies were very effective at increasing profits and eliminating competitors. Now, what happens during this time is you began to get these ideas about this changing society as people began to look for ways to explain the social order of the Gilded Age. And remember, the key idea with regard to regulation and government was this idea of laissez faire, to leave alone. The government should not attempt to control or regulate business. And some individuals, such as Herbert Spencer, the Wolverine's father figure you see right there, was an English social philosopher, and he took Charles Darwin's ideas about the natural world and applied them to the world of business. And it's this idea of survival of the fittest, that the wealthy were fit, hardworking, whereas the poor were just the weak in society, and therefore they should not be helped, and we should advocate for laissez-faire. There were other ideas, for example, the gospel of wealth. There was a belief that the wealthy had a moral obligation to help out those who were less fortunate, and Andrew Carnegie advocated in the famous article called Wealth that the rich have a moral obligation to make it rain, to donate to those individuals in need by donating to charity and hospitals and public libraries and so on. And Carnegie is going to donate huge amounts of money to those different causes. In spite of these different ideas, there was continuing to be a public outcry of the growing corporate power, and in 1890 you get a very significant act of government regulation called the Sherman Antitrust Act, and this outlawed trust and other monopolies that fixed prices or restrained trade. And once again, the government is going to be watching and monitoring business. Just like the Interstate Commerce Act, though, in the beginning, it's not very effective at regulating corporate power and abuse. And in fact, the Sherman Antitrust Act is ironically used against labor unions to break them up during this time period. And that leads us to labor unions. Labor unions, the labor movement, is going to challenge this pro-business climate. They're going to confront corporate power, but they're going to have a lot of challenges during this period as well. There was a division between skilled and unskilled workers. You know, should you organize the skilled and unskilled together? There were ethnic and racial divisions. Very often labor unions were anti-Chinese immigrants and other groups. You had hostility from corporations and no protection by the government. In fact, scabs, replacement workers, were often brought in when workers went on strike. Court injunctions were used to force workers back into the factory. Yellow dog contracts, a worker had to agree to sign them, and therefore they could not join a union. Blacklist if you were involved in the movement, where you were banned from working in certain industries. And public opinion was very often against unions because they were oftentimes viewed as being radical. In spite of these challenges, you're going to see the growth of the national labor movement. You see the National Labor Union formed in 1866. They're the first attempt to organize workers in all the different states. They demand things like higher wages and an 8-hour workday, but they're going to have trouble sustaining that movement. The Knights of Labor is also one you should know about. 1869, Terence Powderly opened the union to all workers, skilled and unskilled workers. This was unique, and also included women and African Americans in the movement. They're going to decline following the Haymarket riot in 1886. We'll take a look at that in a second. And the most important one is the American Federation of Labor in 1886. Samuel Gompers, under the leadership of Samuel Gompers, they're going to focus on skilled workers, and they're going to focus really not on social issues, but what are known as bread and butter issues. Issues such as wages and working conditions. So none of that social stuff that the Knights of Labor was famous for. And by 1900, they will be the largest labor union in the nation, but they will have limited success in the beginning. There's going to be a lot of examples of labor unrest throughout the country, And you're going to see that on this map, all those areas in pink. There were some sort of strikes happening, and some major ones you should know about for APUSH. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877. Rutherford B. Hayes eventually sends in the federal troops to end the labor unrest. In 1886, there's the famous Haymarket bombing, where a bomb explodes during a public meeting in Haymarket Square near Chicago. And although it was the work of radical anarchists, a bunch of people end up getting arrested, and the public views the labor union as a whole as a radical and violent movement. And so that suffers, labor unions suffer a setback during this event. And of course, Homestead strike. 1892, Henry Clay Frick uses a lockout private security guards known as Pinkertons and Scabs to defeat steelworkers at Andrew Carnegie's factory. And we'll talk about the Pullman strike in Eugene Debs in another lecture. So make sure you understand how workers responded to this changing industrial economy and how business leaders justified their wealth. That's going to do it for today. And remember, if you want to earn a 5, you gotta subscribe. If you liked the video, if it helped you out, click like. If you have any comments, just you want to say thanks, comment on the video. And have a wonderful day. Peace.